Welcome everyone to the first Torah study of the spring 2025 semester. Besides a new law semester, we have a new president and we have an old president. And they both engaged in pardoning, which is a specific presidential right. I want if you could just quickly turn to the last page of the handout. So it's page 11. The handouts are in the back, right behind Professor Lewin. There are handouts, should be enough handouts. So if you take a look at the last page, here we have from Federalist number 74. Federalist, right? I'm sure you all know what the Federalist is. I imagine you all know what the Federalist is at this point in your law education. Okay. Okay, but even if you know what the Federalist is, you definitely know what Article 1, Section 2, Clause 1 of the Constitution is. And that's the bottom of the page. And that is, so the first part of that clause is the president shall be the commander-in-chief. Wonderful. And if you take a look at the last line, and he shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. Okay, so the president has very specific powers of pardoning. And it is explained better by Alexander Hamilton, writing as anonymously, in the New York, the New York packet in March 25th, 1788, Federalist number 74. Okay, so we're not. This is the Jewish class. This is the Jewish law. So we're not going to go into, but just want to look at. If you could look at one line from the Federalist, and this is sort of what everything is going to revolve around. The criminal code of every country partakes so much of necessary severity, right? Laws are harsh, that without an easy access to exceptions in favor of unfortunate guilt, justice would wear a countenance too sanguinary and cruel. That's a big statement about the cruelty of justice. You have future lawyers in the room, so it's very important to think about that, why the president has a pardon. I want to talk about it maybe, now we're here to talk about it, pardon in Torah law and Jewish law. So back to page 1, if I may. Page 1, from Deuteronomy. Now, this is a very specific law. This is a religious law that there are times that, again, one of the main prohibitions in the Torah, in the Bible, is paganism, against paganism. No pagans, no idols. So it talks about if a guy, he's an idol worshiper, and he is inciting other people to worship idols. If you take a look, so that's a capital crime. And if you take a look at verse 11, and you are to stone him with stones, said he died. No, not that one. Sorry, verse 9. Do not be favorably inclined towards him. Do not listen to him. Do not view him compassionately. Do not take pity, and do not cover for him. So here you have a very, very strong statement that if a guy's convicted of capital crime, the capital crime of inciting people to paganism, then there's no mercy, no mercy. And if you look at Rashi, his commentary, because normally we are very much in favor of being nice. And again, we have a famous comment, don't then idly buy against your fellow. Here, don't show him mercy. Don't do anything. So here you have just an example, one of the examples, and there's another example in chapter 9, verse 21, on the bottom of page 1. You shall not have compassion. Life for a life, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, head for head, foot for foot. Now, we all know that in Jewish oral law tradition, you don't chop off anyone's hands or feet. It's all monetary payments. But the first part of the verse is you are not to have compassion. So if I would ask you, just by reading these two verses in the Torah, what do you think the Jewish law of pardoning is? It wouldn't sound like it would be the most Jewish. Now, I have here again, there are 3 philosophies I have on page 2 from David Hume, Immanuel Kant, and C.S. Lewis. Now, none Jewish, but nevertheless, these are different ideas of why it is okay to punish people. I try to, C.S. Lewis, if you look at the last line of the page, my contention is that this doctrine, Merciful though it appears really means that each one of us, from the moment he breaks the law, is deprived of the rights of a human being. That's a very strong statement from C.S. Lewis. Kant says the same thing, and David Hume. So the idea of punishment, if someone who does something wrong, is not only biblical. You see here the philosophers, the early philosophers of reason, late 1700s, 1800s, who dealt with this problem that people have rights, people should be granted all the rights in the world. This is where and reason, Kant, of course, Hume, C.S. Lewis. Nevertheless, there is a concept, if you do something wrong, you have to get punished. And there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Seemingly like the Torah. So where does pardoning come into the equation? So one obvious answer, and there's sort of an obvious answer to this, and this explains, there are two ways to deal with the problem, meaning, why would you need pardoning in the first place? You only would need pardoning, as Alexander Hamilton explained in the Federalist Papers, is because sometimes justice is severe. Sometimes justice is too harsh and too exacting. And and again, we here in America, for those of you who are old enough to remember, when they had before they had mandatory sentencing and after, right? For those of you who remember the crime wave in the early 90s in New York City, and then the what was called, I think, the broken glass philosophy. No one? Anyone? Nobody? Nobody old enough? When I went to Brooklyn College in the 90s, so if you stopped at a red light, there were squeegee guys. No one remember this? Yeah, I remember that. You remember that? Yeah, right. Those were great. Those days they would come to your window and squeegee your window, then they would break your glass if you didn't give them $5. So when Giuliani took over, he threw everyone in jail for squeegeeing. Now that's harsh. It didn't make sense. And the theory was if you stop all the squeegee guys, all crime will end. Who knows? I don't know. That's what you're here for, right? To study all these questions. So if you're too strict, that's no good. If you're too lenient, that's no good. So there's this tension we have. So Hamilton said, you know why you need pardons? You need pardons for the obvious reason, because justice sometimes has to be strict, but then there has to be a human compassion and a human element that you understand that it was too severe, and you have to have pardon. You have to have compassion. So we just read the Torah, no compassion. So it seems to be out of place. So the truth is, the answer is, the Torah and the Jewish law front loads the compassion. You could backload the compassion, which is severe punishment and then pardon. So the compassion comes after the severity. Or you could have compassion that you never convict anyone. So that you only convict those people who are truly, 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 truly deserving. And that is seemingly, if you take a look at the oral Torah, in the Mishnah to Sanhedrin, that's clearly how the Torah was set up. So again, we're not going to go through it all. We have a limited time. But if you take a look here, whole of page 3, I quoted a bunch of Mishnayos. So that's the oral Torah in Sanhedrin. And it was almost impossible to convict anyone. The witnesses, again, back then you had to have witnesses. There were no video cameras. You had 7 questions. Did you know what year it was, what day it was? Then they said, keep asking questions. So if you look here, number 2, Ben Zakkai, right? He would ask you about the color and the shape. Again, if someone killed someone under a fig tree, you'd have to also remember what the fig looked like. I mean, it's not. You could say, I saw Jack killed, John, and clearly, and I knew what day of the week it was. I knew what day of the year it was. I knew what time it was, and everything works out. And they said, but what color was the fig tree? The figs. And you're like, okay, guy goes off scot-free. Yeah. Question to the back. I'm going to repeat the question just for the recording. Go ahead.
No, but your statement about it being the color of the fig tree.
Yeah.
It was. I remember this case. It was because the person used
So the Gemara discussed right. So the question is, the Gemara does describe why was it important. So the Gemara says maybe because it was actually relevant to the actual murder itself. But even so, it does. There's a pattern here. If you look through each one of the cases, where we're trying our best to be absolutely certain. So if you keep going on, they open the deliberations that anyone who has a reason to acquit goes first. And even if you're a student, so imagine you are today we have law clerks. So they had back then also clerks. So if you had a case and the clerk had a reason to acquit. So today a clerk doesn't get an opinion. He's just there to help out the judge. But back then, in the times of the Talmud and Sanhedrin, if the clerk had a reason to acquit the guy, we listened to him. But if he had a reason to convict the guy, we wouldn't listen to him. So you see that we're pushing acquittal. And not only that, it keeps going on. In majority, again, we don't have time. And not only that, just the last point, we would think it's not a majority. You need a majority. So let's say a court is the minor courts are 23 judges. So that's an odd number. So what would be a majority? 12 versus 11. 12 to 11 wins for acquittal, but not for conviction. You need a majority of 2. So you would have to get either 13-10 or higher, but if it's 12-11, can't convict. But you can acquit. So you see that there's this front loading, and it goes even further. And the trial is ended, and you're carrying out the punishment, the capital punishment. If anyone says, I have something to say, bring it back. That means there's always appeals, but only appeals to acquit, never to convict. So you see, we don't have time, but if you go through the sources, it's very, very front-loaded in the desire not to convict. So you know why there's no need for pardoning? Because there was almost never any convictions. And if you look about it here, we're not going to read this, but if you look earlier in the Mission Sanhedrin, we intimidate the witnesses. Now, intimidating witnesses sounds like a bad thing, right? But it doesn't mean intimidating witnesses like, you threaten them, but you threaten them and say, listen, you better be sure, because you know that killing someone is one of the worst things ever. And if you're a party to having someone killed for a crime they didn't commit, you're a murderer. So it means we really, really make sure that the witnesses and everyone gets it right. So you want to know why there's no pardoning? Because there's no need for pardoning in a case when justice is never severe. Again, the whole point of Alexander Hamilton, the Constitution, was because justice has to be severe, therefore you need pardoning. Well, the Torah has the other way around. We're not going to be severe in our convictions and our getting criminals, so therefore you don't need pardoning. But then there's a problem, and you obviously see the problem. What's the problem with this? What's the problem with, if I may say, with Torah law, the Torah system? Sorry?
It believes that everybody's going to follow that. What happens when they...
No. Say a little better. What's the problem? Yeah?
Everyone will get away with...
Right, no one's ever going to be convicted of anything. Yeah. And if no one gets convicted, that's a horrible society.
What about the 2 witnesses?
What about them?
In the capital case.
Yeah.
2 witnesses.
Yeah.
You actually have to tell
Yeah, what's the question?
Yeah, I thought people would be put to death for a certain...
Right, so they almost never happened. Because the bar to get a conviction is so high, it's almost impossible. Yes, there is capital crime, the capital punishment, 100%. But again, I didn't bring the sources here, but it was almost never ever carried out because it was such a severe thing to do. But then you're back to the other problem. If you never convict anyone, you never kill anyone, you never punish anyone, so then people were like, this is great. Criminals having a field day. So I want to skip ahead. Okay, take a look at the top of page 5. This is from Maimonides, and for those interested, it's based on 2 pieces of the Talmud, one in the Babylonian, one in the Jerusalem, right? But if you take a look here, top of page 5. A court has the authority to administer lashes, which is another type of punishment, to a person who is not required to receive lashes, and to execute a person who is not liable to be executed. Maimonides says you should know courts have extrajudicial power. Now that sounds funny. Courts are judicial, right? How does it mean the courts have extrajudicial power? What that means is, and here's the problem, the way the court system is set up based on the Torah and the oral law, it never will do anything. So then the courts have the right to go against or make their own rules. In other words, they have a right to figure out how society works. So if you look at the Torah, you're like, oh my gosh, there's no criminal justice system. But then the Maimonides says, no, but of course they had to institute ideas that would make a society work. The most famous example He says, an incident occurred where they lashed a man for engaging in relations with his wife under a tree. Pardon me, it's a little, right? So the Talmud tells of a case, a man and a woman, a man and wife, nothing wrong. But they were publicly immodest. Okay? They got punished. There is nowhere in the Torah, the whole Bible, you can look it up beginning to end, oral to oral, right? It nowhere says that's illegal. They're married, everything's great, what's the problem? It's immoral. So they got punished. Secondly, a person in the times of the Greeks, when the Hellenistic Jews were starting to compete with the rabbis for the definition of what Judaism is, so the rabbis, if someone rode a horse on Shabbos, which is not a capital crime, it's not. They treated it as such because it was eroding the fabric of society. And then famously, Shimon ben Shetach hung 80 women. So they were convicted of sorcery, witches, right? And he killed 80 of them on day. Now, Judaism never kills. And the Talmud, if you look at the bottom here, how could you do that? 80 people to be killed in one day. The answer was because sorcery we had to do something. So there's an unbelievable explanation of all this. If you take a look at page 6, and I believe on page 7 as well, it's very long. There was a rabbi, he lived in Spain in the end of the 13th, beginning of the 14th century, Rabbi Nissen of Durandi, and he has a book called Rashot Aran, his expositions, and he speaks about that there, if you take a look here, and it really explains everything. This one, it's an article, this one article explains everything. There are two systems of law according to the Torah. One is carrying out God's will. We would call that the Beit Din, the Beis Din. That if you look at the Torah, if you look at the Bible, it says here, kill someone or to eye for an eye, whatever that means. That means there's a court system set up to carry out God's will. But it's a weird thing because we're humans. And it's very dangerous when humans start claiming to act in God's name. It's very, very dangerous. Therefore, the way the Beit Din, the way the court system, which was purporting to act in God's name, had to be very, very careful that they were 100% certain they were carrying out God's will. And therefore, it's better, not only, everyone to go scot-free, that to kill someone wrongly in God's name. We don't want people killing in God's name. If it needs to be, it needs to be, and that's what the Torah wants. But it's set up in a way that it has to be 1,000,000,000%. But then there's a problem. Society doesn't work that way. But that's his point. The Beis Din, the Torah law, everything you see was actually not built for society. Because that is what the definition of a king was. Now, we're not arguing monarchy versus democracy. That's not the point here. But the point is that there are secular authorities. The king. The king is responsible for making sure society functions. Because we might call it extrajudicial, but that is actually the secondary judicial system. There's a judicial system that is carrying out God's law, which is almost impossible to get right, and therefore we're so afraid to carry out anything, versus the king. The king can do whatever he wants. So if you got to kill 80 women in one day because they're witches, no problem. And that is, if you take a look here, right, he says here, the top of the page, but they also need judges for an additional reason, to enforce the laws of the Torah, to punish those liable, whether or not their transgression is detrimental to society. And certainly these two considerations shall entail two functions. One, punishing a man in accordance with true justice. The other, punishing him for the benefit of society, the exigencies of the hour. And that's basically the whole sum of the idea that it's really a very powerful idea, and it sort of explains all of Jewish law, criminal law, religious law, that on one hand, when it comes to carrying out God's will, of course there's no pardons. Because it's so front-loaded that you have to get it right, that you would never get it wrong. And if you ever carry out a punishment, of course it's right. And you can't pardon because who are you to speak in God's name? That means once a person is guilty in God's eyes, and we've come to that conclusion, no human can pardon him. But to get to that point almost never happened either, because it was a question of what's right or what's wrong. And then the second, of course, there is a pardoning. In the second law, there's pardoning, because it's all about humans deciding what's the best way to run society. So in such a situation, well, if a human decides that that it has to be that way, good. But then to change your mind, also good. And someone asked me, is there a source for that? Is there an actual source that mentions pardoning? And the answer is yes. But before we do that, just really quickly, we don't have time. This is obviously a little bit longer lecture, but for those of you familiar with your books of the prophets, if you look in the book of Shmuel or Samuel, 2 Samuel, you will two great stories, and I have them both here. One is, you all know that King David had a lot of problems with his kids. One is, again, it's a little bit not so nice, but one son raped a daughter. Okay, that's called Amnon and Tamar, 2 Samuel 13:1. His other son, Avshalom, went ahead and so son A killed son B because he raped the sister. I know it sounds a little ridiculous, but it's part of the books of the prophets. And the question is, what should you do? And there's a great story, which we don't have time for, obviously, but there's a great story here where Yoav, his general, got a woman to go and convince King David to pardon his son. And so it ends here with, on top of page 9. Again, you can read this on your own time. The last line, the king said to Yoav, I will do this thing, go and bring back my boy Avshalom. Yoav flung himself to the ground, prostrated himself. He blessed the king today. Your servant knows he has found favor with you, my lord king, for your majesty has granted the servant's request. The other story, and again we also don't have time for, is in the book of Samuel, same book, 2 Samuel 16, when Avshalom, this son, eventually rebelled against King David and tried to usurp the monarchy from his father. And he basically gathered an army and tried to a mutiny, insurrection, whatever word you want to use, against his father, King David. And King David's running away. He's running away from his son. And a man gets up at the top of the mountain. His name is Shimi ben Gera, chapter 16 of Shmuel. And he starts cursing out King David. Like throwing stones at him and cursing him. And which is, again, King David's still king, really, just because his son is a mutiny. And the head of David's army, Avishai, says, I'm going to kill this guy. He's a dead dog. Let him get him. He says, no, it's from God. Leave it. And then eventually when King David beats his son, wins, and he kills his son Avshalom, not him, but his general. Look at I just bolded and underlined it. David said, what should I do with you? Should a single Israelite be put to death today? Don't I know that today I'm again king over Israel? King said to Shimi, you shall not die. Again, here's a man who committed treason, literal treason. And David said, you know what? I got my job back. I'm king. I pardon you. So the Rambam, it's not here? Okay. And the Rambam, again, the Maimonides here right above it says, this is actually a proof that a king has the right to kill no matter what. And the one proof that I wanted didn't make it into the sheet. Oh, that can't be. Oh, can't be. No. Lesson learned. Don't make sheets at 2 a.m. You'll have to trust me on this one. I will end with this. There is a Mishnah in Erechim. It talks about, in Torah law, there is a concept of people have value. People have value, and especially when you want to go ahead and donate to the temple, you would say, I give my value. So back then, human beings had value. There was a street value for humans. We don't have to explain why. And therefore, everyone can know their value. So the Mishnah says, anyone who is guilty of capital, who is about to be killed, capital punishment, has no value, because they're about to be dead. You're at capital punishment. You have to kill them. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Says Maimonides, that's true if the base is killing. But if the king is killing, everyone has value, because the king can pardon at any time. And that's the one line that I have. Says in the Rambam, Maimonides' commentary to the Mishnah and Erechim, that a king has the right to pardon. But everything we said, it seems to be not that way, and that's the answer. Because this idea of the Ran, that there are two ways, two judicial systems. One is to carry God's law, front-loaded mercy, therefore no pardoning, and societal law, which is sometimes harsh, sometimes best, whatever is necessary for society, and therefore the Maimonides, that one line says there is pardoning. I thank you for joining me. This was really great. Hope to do this again soon.